Well, here we are again. Good morning and welcome to Rising. We have what I think is a pretty decent show for you today. Wouldn't have it any other way. I'm joined by Niall Stanich. I'm just trying to come up with different things to say.
It's a fantastic show, Robby. A fantastic bright show on a dull, rainy morning.
I overused the word fantastic, I've decided.
Terrific. We'll find something.
There we go.
Yeah, we need to hype ourselves up a little bit.
Get hyped.
But after the hype, we have your radar. So what is on your radar today, Robby?
Hopefully it's not too much of a come down. President Donald Trump and his diplomatic team have achieved, actually, a great success yesterday. This is, in fact, something to celebrate, with the release of the final U.S. hostage held in Gaza by the terrorist group Hamas. Edan Alexander was finally reunited with his family after 19 months in captivity. He holds joint U.S.-Israeli citizenship and was serving in the Israeli army at the time of his capture. Here is some footage of him seeing his mother for the first time in a year and a half.
Yo, yeah! Ay, 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 ay. Eso pasante tanto muerto, paitán. Yo, pamatag, no.
So this is obviously a long overdue outcome that is nevertheless something to celebrate. Specifically, it's a credit to the Trump administration that they were able to bring Edan home. And the reason they achieved this? Well, it's because Hamas signaled a willingness to negotiate directly with the Trump team, specifically Steve Witkoff, who is achieving success where others have failed. That's the story here. Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu broke the ceasefire with Hamas, reinvaded Gaza, and has been unwilling to hold ceasefire and hostage negotiation talks because he wants to reserve the right to attack Gaza again after the hostages are released. But Netanyahu's stance doesn't sit with Trump, who's much more inclined to get some kind of deal that does bring more hostages home immediately. Edan Alexander was the last living U.S. hostage, but Hamas still holds other Israeli hostages and also has the remains of deceased hostages, both Israeli and American. This is as good a point as any to remind everyone watching that Hamas is a brutal terrorist group. It killed men, women, and children on October 7th. Hamas's reign of terror is a humanitarian catastrophe for Israel and for Gaza, and in an ideal world, they would be swept from power by any means necessary. But in reality, Israel's efforts to destroy Hamas have resulted in widespread death and destruction for the civilian population of Gaza, tens of thousands of men and women and children. Because Hamas is embedded within the civilian population, it is a difficult issue to be resolved. Israel rationally doesn't want to let a terrorist group continue to occupy the neighboring territory, yet at the same time, the cost of this war to the people of Gaza is clearly far too high a price to pay. That is where Trump comes in. The Biden administration was pathologically unwilling to put any constraints on the behavior of Netanyahu's government, and when seeking the presidency herself, Vice President Kamala Harris didn't separate herself from her boss's policy at all. And so the slaughter continued. Trump, however, immediately used the U.S.'s considerable leverage over Israel to force a ceasefire deal. Now, it's a shame the deal didn't last. Now, Trump is willing to have his team engage through intermediaries with Hamas in order to protect and rescue Americans. And Israel is taking note of that. Given the news of Edan Alexander's release, Netanyahu has said he would once again send a diplomatic team to Doha, the capital city of Qatar, for ceasefire talks. Qatar has, of course, played an important role in all of this, which is perhaps why the Qataris' gift of a jumbo jet to Donald Trump yesterday raised eyebrows among so many in the media, even many Republicans. Weird flex, yes. But the most important thing is peace. Peace in the Middle East, peace all over the world. Trump is a heck of a lot closer to achieving that than Joe Biden ever was. Don't just take it from me. Even progressives are waking up to that reality. Progressive writer Jeet Heer of The Nation magazine writes, well, it's the lowest of low bars, but Trump is doing more to rein in Israel than Biden ever did. This should spark introspection among Democrats, but it won't. And even Mehdi Hasan, an arch progressive, one of the most outspoken Trump haters I can think of, he admitted on X, the Democrats uselessly and cravenly and self-destructively bowed down to Netanyahu and cleared the ground for Trump to do what they could have done, but chose not to. Pathetic from the Biden administration, pathetic. A big win for Trump. To be sure, not everyone in the MAGA coalition is dedicated to non-interventionism. Witkoff himself is taking flack from people like Mark Levin and other neocons who would rather escalate tensions with Iran. But Witkoff has the firm backing of Trump and of Vice President J.D. Vance, who writes on X, Steve Witkoff is a great guy doing an incredible job. The people sniping at him are mad. He is succeeding where they failed for 40 years. Turns out a lot of diplomacy boils down to a simple skill. Don't be an idiot. Wise words to live by as we all work toward peace.
Interesting stuff, Robby. I agree with a good part of that. I am very much aligned with the views that people like GTR and Mehdi Hassan put forward there. When it comes to the situation in Gaza, I have never put forth a partisan position. I think that Biden's conduct was disgraceful in that regard. One can acknowledge the horrors of October 7th and still be vigorously critical, to say the very least, of the Israeli response, which I think has been an absolute slaughter, which I think is the word you used, and it needs to be brought to an end. So in terms of, acknowledging certain elements in this, yes, the push toward a ceasefire deal originally is worth acknowledging. Yes, the fact that Trump did essentially an end run around the Israelis to get Edan Alexander released, that's definitely worth acknowledging. I think where I probably have differ from a little bit from what you put forth is, if I'm understanding correctly, you are putting this in a narrative of Trump really wanting peace or having some sort of principled structure to do that. And I'm very skeptical that he does. I think that when you look at his conduct in that part of the world, or his policies in that part of the world, there's a lot that cuts against that. There will be a lasting peace in Gaza and in Palestine whenever there is a just settlement reached. And I don't see really any evidence that Donald Trump is going to pursue such a settlement. There is his backing for ethnic cleansing. He wouldn't use that word, but I would, for the removal of Palestinians. There is the fact that he has not really put any check on Israel, as it has choked off the supplies of food and aid into Gaza. There's the fact that it's really not clear whether he believes that the West Bank is occupied, which indeed it is under international law. Someone like Mike Huckabee, his ambassador, blatantly does not believe that, thinks it's part of Greater Israel. So I think I differ from you in not thinking that Trump has a constructive policy toward that part of the world. But it's good that this guy was released, and it's good that he is more willing than Biden has been to break with Netanyahu.
Yeah, and I'm welcome to concede that there's some ideological inconsistency to the Trump approach to foreign policy and the Middle East. It's just even inconsistency is better than consistent what I disagree with. And I am hopeful and heartened by, if J.D. Vance is actually the successor to Donald Trump, there will be aspects of J.D. Vance that I like less than Donald Trump. He's more consistently hostile to some of the market principles I think are very important. He's probably even more a believer in tariffs than Donald Trump is. However, when it comes to foreign policy, I do think he has his principles overlap with mine. And when we see, behind the scenes into how he thinks, like we got to see in those text messages, I saw someone who's actually speaking for a non-interventionist philosophy, not just a kind of convenient, well, this looks bad, let's try to cut a deal, but someone who actually believes that the U.S. should have less of a presence in the U.S. That's why he's defending Witkoff here, signaling he's on the Witkoff side during the Mark Levin feud, and I think that's a good thing, and I hope something positive comes from this. It's a difficult situation. We will always remain very supportive of Israel. There would be too clear a cost for either party to pay politically to turn its back on Israel. I don't think that would be good policy, but what level of support we give, and even this is what was so historically unprecedented about Biden specifically with respect to the Israeli government. Even past Republican and Democratic administrations, totally supportive of Israel. But that doesn't mean we didn't exert any pressure on them when Reagan did, the first Bush did, Clinton did, Obama did. They all said, okay, we support you fully. Take out terrorists. But you can't start World War III here. We're not going to let you do that.
Sure.
And Biden just didn't do that.
He did not do that. And we would have much more to say about that, and I'm sure we will in future shows. But coming up on Rising, was former President Biden headed for a wheelchair in his second term? His aides are speaking out in a new book. That's next.
Former President Biden's physical state was so bad in 2023 and 2024 that his aides feared he could end up in a wheelchair. That is according to a new book by CNN's Jake Tapper and Axios' Alex Thompson.
Tapper and Thompson say they interviewed more than 200 people with inside knowledge. According to the authors, Biden's aides felt using a wheelchair during his re-election campaign would have hindered him politically.
Yeah, you think? Biden's physician, Kevin O'Connor, said that Biden could be in for a difficult recovery if he were to fall again. Axios writes that aides took more precautions. Quote, they tried to figure out shorter walking paths, began insisting on handrails for steps up to the stage at his appearances, had him wear sneakers more often, changed his visual briefings before events to ensure he knew every step he was expected to take, and guided him more carefully through the movements.
Another tidbit from the book, this time picked up by The Guardian, shows the frustrations of a top campaign aide to Kamala Harris. David Plouffe is quoted in the book saying he felt that Biden totally effed us by running again, and that Harris's 107-day campaign sprint was a, quote, effing nightmare.
Author Leah Sargent responded on X to Axios' story, writing, the scoop here isn't the wheelchair, it's the lie. Team Biden said he had trouble walking because of an incompletely healed foot fracture. His doctor, both small fractures of his foot are completely healed.
Mediaite writer and editor Tommy Christopher wrote, what's wrong with needing a wheelchair, which, by the way, Biden did not? I hope newsrooms exercise care not to let their hatred of Joe Biden lead them to stigmatize disability. I mean, more than they already have.
That is a completely ridiculous comment. This is not about stigmatizing people who need a wheelchair or have a disability whatsoever. In fact, I find I'm uncomfortable, frankly, all of the beating up we have to do on Biden's physical condition. It's not. Elderly people, our grandparents, should be allowed to retire with dignity and do things that befit their condition in life. It is their fault when they remain in office past the point of capacity. And I'm sorry, being president is a physically demanding job. You have to fly all over the world constantly. It is not, 100, 200 years ago, it was not as physically demanding. The chief executive was one government official among many, but now we have the president is by far the most important person, the U.S. president is the most important person in the world, and it requires a high degree of physical activity and physical exertion.
Well, hold on a second. I'm less dismissive than you are about the disability argument, for the simple reason that the argument against Biden running for a second term was his mental acuity. There's no problem with someone being in a wheelchair, as Franklin Roosevelt was, though it was concealed, as Greg Abbott is in Texas right now. Using a wheelchair does not prohibit people from travel internationally or otherwise, nor does it have an impact upon their capacity to be president or to have any other high-level political office. Now, the question in Biden's case was mental acuity. That's why the debate was so disastrous. If Joe Biden had been sitting down and on his game mentally, that debate would not have been a problem.
Well, sure, but these things are a little bit linked. I mean, FDR was in a wheelchair from contracting polio. It was not a symptom of him becoming older and more frail and more out of it.
But even if it was,
Woodrow Wilson was horrifically incapacitated. He was not particularly mentally incapacitated.
Sure.
If I'm recalling this correctly, he was incapacitated from probably a bout with the Spanish flu that killed tons and tons of people at the time. He was so incapacitated. Edith Wilson was running the government because he was in bed. His mental faculties were all there, but they were hiding the extent to which the president was no longer capable of being president. Right. You can be in such a physical condition that it bears on how you are able to do the job. And in Biden's case, we're not talking. He's not a vigorous young man who had a cycling accident and had to use a wheelchair or something. It's a little bit linked.
Well, I think we'll just agree to disagree on the wheelchair point. But to the David Plouffe point, although I think that Plouffe's achievements in the earlier Barack Obama campaigns are worthy of praise, I'm pretty skeptical of this argument that it was the brevity of Kamala Harris's campaign that was the problem. In fact, I would argue that it's quite compelling to say that she would have her best chance at the very start of the campaign, and the gloss gradually came off of that. And that, when you look at Kamala Harris's political career, the idea that more Kamala Harris makes people more likely to vote for her isn't very well supported by facts. Back in 2020, she ran for the nomination. There was this big launch in Oakland. It was very glamorous. She was considered the coming star. She ended up dropping out before the Iowa caucuses. So I know that Plouffe and everyone else in that campaign has their own vested interest in saying it was all the fault of the brevity of the campaign. Look, I think Biden shouldn't have run for a second term, but I also don't think that the problem with Kamala Harris's campaign was it was too brief.
I broadly agree with that. My only point of possible contention there is that if she'd had more time, she could have replaced the Biden campaign team who were giving her bad advice because they were trying to cover up their own complicity in this whole thing.
Well, and trying to protect his legacy.
Right,
well.
And they did not let her separate. They did not encourage her to separate herself from Biden, which was a fatal campaigning error. But she had in a 100-day campaign, you don't have time to hire new campaign staff. So if she had more time, she might have had the right people in place, is the only advantage I could see that she would have for more campaigning. Otherwise, I agree with you. It could have been, the numbers could have gone off
further.
as a hot brat, Kamala, whatever fake thing that was manifested became exposed as a fake social media ploy. Up next, President Trump has pushed to lower prescription drug costs, targeting what he calls the fat shot in the process. You won't want to miss this. Stay tuned. President Trump says he wants Americans to stop getting ripped off. That's why he signed an executive order to try to lower prescription drug costs.
Specifically, Trump wants Americans to pay a similar amount for particular prescription drugs, as do residents of other countries. The RAND Corporation, a public policy think tank, found that Americans pay 2.78 times more than 33 other comparable nations for prescription drugs.
Here's President Trump explaining the situation with a characteristic touch of humor.
A friend of mine who's a businessman, very, very, very top guy. Most of you would have heard of him. A highly neurotic, brilliant businessman, seriously overweight, and he takes the fat shot drug. President, could I ask you a question? What? I'm in London, and I just paid for this damn fat drug I take. I said, it's not working. He said, I just paid $88, and in New York I pay $1,300. What the hell is going on?
Ideally, Trump says he wants drug prices lowered by 59%, and if the pharmaceutical industry doesn't play ball with the Trump administration, then Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. will impose a price cap that would make U.S. prices match those of other wealthy countries.
Senator Elizabeth Warren downplayed Trump's move, writing in Blue Sky, "This is nothing more than a flashy press release from Donald Trump. Trump should put his weight behind a bill so we can actually lower drug prices. Instead, he and Republicans in Congress are plotting to rip away health coverage from millions of Americans."
Well, this sounds like music to Niall's ears.
I was going to say, and I don't expect you'll be thrilled about President Trump taking a leaf from the Bernie Sanders book, imposing price controls. Well, not exactly, but that at least is implied. What do you
in
think?
fact, many Trump administration officials, before Trump was president, when it was Kamala Harris, criticized a Kamala Harris plan to do the same thing. Yeah. Now, look, I'm certainly against price controls, because they cause shortages. However, the issue here is this is something we subsidize, and so it's a little bit like higher education or student loans. If you both subsidize something, you, the government, but exercise no control over what the provider of the service can pay for it, they'll just absorb the entire subsidy. Like, okay, I offer something everybody needs, whoever, it's widget. We all need one widget a year. I charge $100 for it. The government says, we want to help people pay for the cost of that. We'll give everybody $80. The price of my widget just became $180.
Right.
Like, it is this very simple thing. You can actually see it very clearly in education more than any other. Multiple economic studies have found that the rise in cost of tuitions is just directly tied to how much of the government is willing to pay for it on your behalf. So that's a long way of saying I don't maybe dislike this proposal as much as you might have guessed, even though I am totally against in the abstract the idea of doing price controls. But if you're going to just give people money to cover the cost of something, then you have to exercise some control over what it costs, or else they'll just raise the price so that you have to pay more, the government has to pay more.
Well, look, the basics, as far as I'm concerned, are Americans are paying 3 times more, approximately, than people in other developed countries for drugs. That's obviously wrong. It's not as if drug companies are struggling to make profits. I mean, Merck made, what, 15.6 billion in the last quarter of last year. It's worth about $200 billion. Pfizer's worth about $130 billion. My issue with what Trump did isn't the purported intent, which is to bring drug prices down. It's whether he will follow through after this 30-day pause. Right now, he's kind of asked them politely to do so. And the suggestion is there will be more muscular action taken after 30 days, but we don't know. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I want, before we wrap, I've got to get in my easy fix for this. I have an easy market-based fix for this. You might not even be against it. Again, and it involves deregulating. Right now, why don't you just import the drugs from, they're cheaper in other countries? Why don't we just buy them from there? We can't do that because the FDA makes it illegal to import drugs from other countries. We could have one global market where there's not a different price in different places if you could just have your drugstore provider have it shipped from the UK or France or Germany or wherever it is in the world where it costs less. Amazon does remarkable things with delivery. We're now a global marketplace where you can easily ship things across long distances. The government makes it illegal to do that, which is to the benefit of the drug companies, because then they can charge different prices. Just make it not illegal anymore, and they got to charge everybody the same thing.
I would not.
That's my fix.
I would not actually object to that. This is one of these areas where we have some common ground, because it seems to me that would be equitable, and I wouldn't have an issue with it. Before we wrap, I do want to point out, Robby, though, I think one of the reasons there's some skepticism of this Trump plan on the left is not only whether he will follow through, but is it in some ways a distraction or a smokescreen for what is happening in Congress right now? There you have Republicans proposing these slashing cuts to Medicaid, about $700 billion. And the CBO, which is a non-partisan body, is talking about that plan, if it were enacted, kicking 8.6 million people off health insurance by 2034.
Let me set you at ease. We're just eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse.
We are doing no such thing. We are we are making cuts on the back of poorer people who will end up without health insurance. And I think that is obviously unpopular, rightly so, and I worry that Trump's simply trying to set up a distraction or smokescreen.
Well, and similarly, changes to pricing for drugs, if this is even, is this constitutional? It certainly should not be constitutional for the president to just unilaterally declare a different price for drugs. At the very least, this is a policy that should be approved by Congress, not just declared by the presidency, or else what is Congress even for? If the president has the power to declare what, private sector goods cost all of a sudden, it's just, we then just have a unitary government, right? I mean, what is left for Congress to do?
You're not a fan of nationalized government in general.
I am not, and neither were many Republicans until now. So
yeah, but it's all changed because Trump wants it.
Yeah, I think if Kamala Harris was doing this exact thing, it would be not well received by Republicans.
Up next, Trump's attacks on due process for undocumented immigrants reach the national spotlight. Stay with us. Trump's immigration agenda has thrust the constitutional right of due process into the national spotlight. Democrats and many judges say everyone, even deportees like Kilmar Abrego Garcia, deserve this constitutionally protected right. But President Trump seems to have a different interpretation of the law for non-citizens, repeatedly questioning the constitutional right to due process.
And critics of the administration are outraged, although many supporters of the president argue that non-citizens are not entitled to the same constitutional protections. Here to break it down is Hans von Spakovsky, a senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Welcome to Rising.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, we appreciate it. This is a very important and timely debate to be had right now. You'll hear members of the Trump administration say, immigrants are not entitled to the same necessary due process procedures as citizens. How do you view this topic? What should the government do and not do with respect to illegal immigrants it wants to take some kind of legal action against?
Well, part of the problem here is people are confusing different kinds of government procedures, and they're ignoring what the Supreme Court's already said about this. And what I mean by that is immigration proceedings are civil matters. They're not criminal matters. It's true that in a criminal matter, if the government, for example, is going to prosecute you for murder, yeah, you are entitled to constitutional due process rights, whether you're an alien or a citizen. But when it comes to an immigration issue, if you are an alien who's in the country illegally and the government is moving against you, that's a civil matter. And what the Supreme Court has said in several cases on that issue is that if you are an alien trying to enter the country, you have no due process rights. The government can reject you for any reason or no reason. Once you're in the country, yeah, you do have limited due process rights. But again, what the Supreme Court has said is those due process rights are what Congress decides to give you. And in fact, even, for example, for legal resident aliens, what the Supreme Court has said is, in prior cases, is that due process rights means that the ability of the alien to appear before someone to state their case, whether it is in the executive branch, it doesn't have to be a judicial tribunal. And so if you look at the immigration laws, they only provide certain due process rights. You, for example, are not entitled to a lawyer from the government. The government doesn't have to read you your rights when they arrest and detain you. So your rights are limited. And in fact, there are many particular cases where the immigration law says that, for example, the judiciary has no jurisdiction. So again, it depends on the alien, what kind of case it is, and their status.
I wonder, though, if that is complicating the topic a little bit, because the Fifth Amendment, as you well know, provides that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And the Supreme Court has held that people, regardless of their immigration status, come under the heading of person, and that therefore they are basically entitled to due process. So it seems to me there's a bit of, frankly, with all due respect, hair splitting going on in your case, when in fact the right seems pretty clear.
Well, if you want to blame hair splitting, then blame it on the U.S. Supreme Court. Because again, you're confusing a criminal case with a civil case. I mean, for example, again, if you're an alien and the government says you're illegally in the country, you are entitled to a hearing before an immigration judge, not a federal district court judge under Article 3, but an immigration judge. Immigration judges are actually employees of the Justice Department. If you disagree with what that judge says, if the judge says you're not entitled to be in the U.S., you have the right to appeal that case to the Bureau of Immigration Appeals. Again, that is within the Justice Department. The judges there are employees of the Justice Department. If you disagree with that, federal law does not allow you to appeal to a federal district court judge. Your sole appeal is to federal courts of appeals. So, for example, federal district court judges right now who are hearing cases from aliens who have a deportation order lodged against them, because they already had their hearing before an immigration judge, those judges are actually violating federal law by even considering the case.
And Hans, how about this, though? I think one of the arguments that people are making is, but look at what is being done now by the Trump administration with some of these illegal immigrants. They're being detained in facilities, and then they're being shipped off, in some cases, to a prison in El Salvador. So while I agree with you that it's a civil matter and they're not entitled to the same rights in terms of civil matter, the way the Trump administration is carrying this out, almost maybe they're saying it's a civil matter, but it resembles a criminal matter in the ultimate fate of some of these illegal immigrants themselves. Does that complicate the picture at all?
Well, again, it depends on what the status of that alien is. If there's already a deportation order that's been issued by an immigration judge, that means they've had their due process, they've had their hearing. And if what the Department of Homeland Security is doing is simply enforcing that deportation order, in other words, issuing a detainer warrant, finding that alien, arresting them, detaining them, and then shipping them out of the country, they are fully within the provisions of immigration law. And keep in mind, there's about 3 million unenforced deportation orders sitting at the Department of Homeland Security because the Biden administration basically refused to enforce those orders. But that's a different situation than an alien who is detained, who has never had an immigration hearing. That would be a different situation.
But Hans, if you're elevating the importance, or at least respecting the importance of immigration courts, we get back to the case of Mr. Abrego Garcia, who had an immigration lawyer, or an immigration judge, excuse me, say he should not be deported to El Salvador, and the Trump administration deported him to El Salvador. So even as you make the larger argument, would you at least agree that there is a problem with the administration's actions in that regard?
No, because you're not realizing something else, which is because the immigration judges in those cases found that he was illegal in the U.S., but they said, we're going to give you a one-time waiver because of his fear of a particular rival gang in El Salvador. But what you're overlooking is the fact that under, again, federal immigration law, the Attorney General of the United States has the ability to override the decision of any immigration judge or the Bureau of Immigration Appeals. And that's clearly what happened in this case. Plus, remember, the waiver was given because of the existence of one particular gang. That gang no longer exists in El Salvador. That was one of the gangs that was completely broken up by the current president of El Salvador when he came into office and declared emergency powers. So the sole ground for which this guy was not deported after being found illegally in the U.S. has disappeared. Plus, again, under the law, the Attorney General has the ability to override that decision. I've not seen anyone mention that in the press, but that's part of federal immigration law.
Going to have to leave it there. Hans, thank you so much for joining us to discuss. We really appreciate it.
Sure, thanks for having me.
Next up, is the South African government calling Trump a liar? We'll discuss and debate it. Stay with us.
Welcome. Welcome to the United States of America.
Dozens of white South Africans landed at Dulles International Airport on Monday as refugees, fleeing what they say is racial discrimination in their home country.
Deputy Secretary of State Chris Landau was there to greet the Afrikaners after an executive order from President Trump prioritized their resettlement in the United States, despite the suspension of a broader refugee program back in January.
Trump on Monday defended the move, claiming that a genocide was taking place in South Africa. Take a listen.
Farmers are being killed. They happen to be white, but whether they're white or black makes no difference to me. But white farmers are being brutally killed, and their land is being confiscated in South Africa. And the newspapers and the media, television media, doesn't even talk about it. If it were the other way around, they'd talk about it. That would be the only story they'd talk about.
The South African government has denied those allegations, saying in a statement last Friday, quote, "We reiterate that allegations of discrimination are unfounded. The South Africa Police Service statistics on farm-related crimes do not support allegations of violent crime targeted at farmers generally or any particular race. Moreover, even if there are allegations of discrimination, it is our view that these do not meet the threshold of persecution required under domestic and international refugee law."
Meanwhile, CNN had a fiery debate about this topic after one panelist suggested the white South Africans should go back to Germany. Watch this.
Part of that is that the people who are native to that land deserve their rightful land back. That is not what the Afrikaners actually want to have happen. That is what they are saying is discrimination. If the Afrikaners don't actually like the land, they can leave that country.
They are. They're leaving to come here.
No. They can
These
leave
refugees
and go,
are coming here.
They can actually leave and go to where their native land is, which is probably Germany.
Are you against them coming here?
Holland, probably. Holland.
To go back to Germany. I wanted to play that clip to show that some of the incoherence here on the, like, everybody go back to where they came from, which I thought was supposed to be a nativist right-wing talking point, but is, first, I guess, also a kind of cultural progressive talking point. I think it's very, we're all a mixed, trying to give back to whoever it is. Like, we can't sort those things out anymore. Everyone is from somewhere else. We all come from what, the eastern side of Africa to begin with is where all of humanity originates from. So I guess we all have to go back there. It's very silly to me.
Well, I mean, it is very silly. I don't agree with that. But I do think that it is outrageous, honestly, that Trump is on one hand halting a refugee resettlement program for everybody else except Afrikaners. I mean, that just seems completely indefensible to me. He halted that resettlement program, leaving 12,000 people in limbo. You have, for example, Afghans who helped the United States, whatever one thinks of the war there, helped the United States, are now in danger of their lives, can't come here. People suffering horrific situations in Democratic Republic of Congo or Sudan or numerous places around the world can't come here. And then we had a White House spokesperson who we didn't quote there, talking about a commitment to human rights being central to the America First agenda. I mean, that's a ludicrous claim when refugee status is being denied to people who have already cleared all the bars needed to gain that status. And what is happening? You have these 49 Afrikaners brought in and hailed as some victory for human rights. Just briefly, Robby, on the South Africa point, one of the elements of evidence for the lack of discrimination is that whites in South Africa are still in a very advantageous position relative to the black population, owning about 75% of farmland with just 7% of the population, about 20 times as wealthy as black South Africans on average, about 3 times less likely to be unemployed. So this is just nonsense and an appeal to racial grievance, as I said in the show yesterday.
I have no firsthand knowledge of the situation in South Africa. I can't speak to it whatsoever. I frankly don't care. They are welcome to come here if they're facing racial discrimination or not. I don't have any objection to them.
Do you care about the Afghans?
Well, let me finish what I was saying. I was going to say next.
Okay.
I do not agree with terminating the Afghan resettlement project at all. I think we went there and destroyed their country, and these people who sided with us and helped us, absolutely, we should make things right with them, and they should be able to come here. I don't agree with halting that program at all. I am generally pro-immigration, more pro-immigration than most people on the right. My faction kind of lost that battle, so we have to deal with what we have to deal with and make the affirmative case for immigrants to come into this country that are going to, frankly, survive political scrutiny, are going to be welcomed enough. Again, if I was running the country, if I was saying things, I would bring in all sorts of people. But there is widespread concern about immigrants and crime and the welfare state and how all those things impact. I think the Trump administration, whatever they're saying about human rights here, it's not really about human rights. We can't bring all the, we're sad for them and it's sorry for them, and I don't want to make their countries worse. I don't want to overthrow their leaders. I don't want to have any intervention in them that makes them worse, but we can't just bring all the world's poor and starving and dispossessed here. We just can't do it. There's no political, you recognize there's no political even if you and I were okay doing it, there's not enough political will to do it. We can't do that. This specific group is not, it's fine if they come, it's not doesn't do anything negative.
The point, Robby, isn't really, you're talking about the broader issue of migration and who is economically advantageous to the country. This is about a refugee program, separate even from asylum claims, that has typically been capped at, around 60,000 people a year. Now, Trump has suspended the whole thing, accepting these people. Now, it is not, the issue of whether someone is a legitimate refugee or not is completely separate from what economic gains they might bring here, or this argument, which I think you were making about whether they would be welcomed. Well, welcomed by whom? Are black Americans going to be thrilled by the importation of Afrikaners, who were, after all, by heritage, the people who were the drivers of apartheid? I mean, presumably not. So this idea that refugee status should hinge upon either economic well-being or English language or whiteness, I mean, those just seem enormously toxic and wrong criteria to adopt.
I mean, that's the views of millions and millions of Americans that...
Well, millions and millions of Americans are often wrong about all sorts of things.
Well, the citizens of the country have decided that They want less immigration into their country. I mean, do you disagree with that? That is the clear mandate of the people in choosing Donald Trump, is to turn down the Nile on immigration to some degree. And, I'm trying to argue to keep the H-1B visa plan in place, to still admit as many high-skilled immigrants from all over the world as we can. And yes, and then to prioritize the deportations in this country to only deal with gang members and criminals, not, just going door to door and people who've been here and not causing any trouble for a long time. I'm doing my best, my friend. I don't know, what else do you want from me? There is not a public appetite to bring all of the refugees in the world here.
It's not, we never did bring all of the refugees in the world here. If we bring 60,000 refugees here, that is easily accommodated in a nation of 330 million people. And the basis on which you get that status should be on well-founded fear of persecution, not because you're white or Elon Musk likes you. Anyway, Republicans accusing Democrats of launching their own January the 6th, the showdown at a New Jersey ICE detention facility next. House Democrats in hot water. Some members of the party could face criminal charges after the Trump administration says they tried to storm an ICE detention facility in New Jersey.
Take a look. That confrontation last Friday happened after Newark Mayor Ras Becerra allegedly tried to enter the facility and was eventually arrested for trespassing. Democratic representatives LaMonica McIver, Rob Menendez, and Bonnie Watson-Coleman, all from New Jersey, can be seen at one point yelling in a melee with DHS agents.
The agency claims ICE body cam footage also shows Representative McIver, shown in the red blazer, elbowing her way past an agent to get through the gate and onto the property. McIver says she and other members of Congress were roughed up by agents. All three members of Congress deny that they were trying to storm the facility, saying they were there in an oversight capacity. Take a listen.
This facility that had just opened up on May 1st, it had over 100 detainees. We were getting reports prior to our tour that children were there. We did not know the status of the facility or the status of the detainees. And so that is why we showed up there to do our job as members, and New Jerseyans count on us to do our job.
DHS now says they're looking at arresting the members of Congress who were there on Friday, something that Michael Knowles says does need to happen, drawing similarities to January 6th.
On January 6th, the right-wingers who went into the Capitol and made a ruckus of themselves, they were eccentric civilians. Here, the people who were doing an insurrection at a government building and trespassing and assaulting police officers on camera, those people are Democrat elected officials. I know that DHS is talking about charging these people with crimes. More arrests should be made. They should arrest these members of Congress who were there, who assaulted cops, who were trespassing. Absolutely.
I'm sure you're going to appreciate the eccentric individual's defense.
One of the most
January
ridiculous
6th.
things I've ever heard in my life, honestly. I mean, that's just so ridiculous. 140 law enforcement officers injured on January the 6th, trying to overturn a democratic election.
Well,
I mean,
and I believe
we can have the debate about what happened at the ICE facility, and I think some of it is mired in confusion, honestly, because we have claim and counterclaim and video shot by each side. But the parallel with January the 6th.
I make no
nonsense.
excuses for anyone who was fighting with the cops. They should be, or who committed violence against the cops. They should be charged. In that case, in January 6th, for certainly, I would not have pardoned them, as I've said. And I feel the same about what happened at the facility. I agree with you, Niall. I think it's a little bit unclear. You never want to. I never, as a libertarian, want to just take the police's word for it, or the authority or the law enforcement, whoever it is, that protesters were acting out of control. This is why I favor body camera footage and revealing those kinds of things, so that we don't need to just rely on people's conflicting agendas. We can settle it for ourselves. You absolutely have the right to protest, whether you're a legislator or a citizen or anyone else. You can show up to the facility, protest outside. You can't tussle with law enforcement. You can't block the entrance, as these protesters I understand it was at a different protest at the same facility, but at a different group of people were like religious protesters were actually blocking the entrance. Can't do that. If you do that, you're going to get detained or arrested or something. It's a little bit like that judge case with the judge who is alleged to have helped an illegal immigrant evade capture. The government's going to have to make its case that that's what she did. She gets her defense. They're entitled to their defense. just protesting is not illegal, if that's all they were doing, or they were trying to gain access using the appropriate channels, it's all fine. We need more information. What else can I say?
So I would applaud you for your skepticism of police and authority, which I'm well aware that that is how you feel, and I think that more people from a libertarian bent, making that argument would be useful to political discourse. I think we agree that there's a lot that is unclear in terms of the actual events. One thing that is not unclear is that members of Congress have a legal right to inspect immigration detention facilities in that oversight role, and the law is equally clear that they do not need to provide prior notice to do so. And this is a point that AOC and numerous other Democrats have made in the past couple of days. I would add, in fairness, that I presume that is one of the reasons why Ras Baraka, the mayor of Newark, has been charged and the members of Congress have not. He obviously would not have that protection. That condition would not cover him. Now, a couple of things I think are being a little bit lost here. One is that the members of Congress are saying that they were manhandled by the cops, essentially, agents of the state in one way or another. And they have the right to make that claim and pursue that claim if they wish to do so, just as the government in various guises has the right to make its argument that there were assaults carried out. The fact that the members of Congress were allowed to be there and are legally entitled to go into the facility makes me curious, were they illegally barred from doing so? Were they, as McIver says, roughed up? Hakeem Jeffries talks about them being physically accosted. Hakeem Jeffries, I should say, wasn't there. He is speaking in his role as House Minority Leader. So, and a number of other Democratic lawmakers have made that claim. I want to know more about that, as well as wanting to know more about the overall picture.
Yeah, I mean, in the footage, we're seeing on screen right now, it looks like a general scene of confusion, yes, and police maybe fearing being overwhelmed. There are a lot of people there, pushing toward the entrances, but can't just take their word for it. Gotta know, right? The police obviously have the right to, if they can lay hands on you if they're detaining you or stopping you from going somewhere in legitimate circumstances. But I don't know whether that's the case or not.
Right. Another strand to this debate, which is also being sort of overshadowed by debates about who exactly pushed who in the footage that we're looking at, is that this facility in New Jersey is one of those run by a private prison company. I'm never sure if it's pronounced Geo Group or GEO Group, but they operate a number of private prisons. And in this particular case, they were actually being sued by Newark, by the city of Newark, because of provisions that they allegedly had not met. So I think, you probably have much less skepticism about the private prison industry than I do. I am inherently skeptical of for-profit detention facilities or incarceration facilities, and I would question whether there have been complaints already about the conditions in this particular one in New Jersey, and that presumably was one of the reasons that prompted both the protest and the desire of the members of Congress to see it.
I have some mixed views on private prisons. I think my biggest concern with it is probably not, well, you'll probably share this concern, but is not the same as what you just outlined, is that then the financial incentive at like a state basis, these contractors
to incarcerate more people.
They have a financial incentive to lobby the legislature to make the laws more stringent, right, for their own economic benefit. Right. I think that's a pretty perverse incentive. I'm a little bit skeptical of claims that like the conditions in private prisons are worse or that there's less accountability. In some ways, my understanding, even from very pro-criminal justice people who are just not fans of the prison system in general, who have suggested to me in the past, in some cases even suing private prisons is an easier way to get accountability than the public prisons, where you can get no accountability for similar levels of abuse. So I think it's the financial incentive part that bothers me, not necessarily the conditions being necessarily so much worse. Conditions can be pretty bad in prisons across the board.
Absolutely, and I mean, I think that is something that is rightly sounded by people. Our friend Stephen Kent, who sometimes sits in your seat on Fridays, is a guy who's very into prison reform from a sort of libertarian perspective, because he believes that the conditions of incarceration, regardless of whether it's a private or state or federal prison, are injurious to people actually being rehabilitated.
Yeah. Unlike Amber, who's on Fridays, probably like jail them all.
Jail them all in the worst conditions possible, I think, would be Amber's view.
I don't think we're besmirching her. I think
she'd enthusiastically
laugh as well.
agree with that.
Up next, we speak to a native Palestinian who says he's lost 30 family members to the war in Gaza. Tragic, terrifying story. You won't want to miss that interview. Stay with us. As American-Israeli hostage Edan Alexander returns home after surviving over 500 days in captivity, Israel does seem poised to follow through with its commitment made last week to intensify its offensive in Gaza.
Over the past 18 months, more than 50,000 Palestinians have been killed, most of whom are women and children. Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib is a native Palestinian and among the millions of Palestinians who have lost loved ones in this conflict. In fact, he has lost 30 family members. He's also the director of Realign for Palestine. He joins us now. Welcome, Ahmed.
Thanks for having me.
So I think before going into the humanitarian proposals that you have in mind, firstly, I just want to express sympathy for the suffering that your family has experienced. And I don't think we should just leave it as you've lost 30 family members. Tell us a little more about your family's experiences.
Well, very sadly, the childhood homes that I grew up in, I grew up in Gaza City in the north, were hit and destroyed early on in the war. My second childhood home in Rafah City in the south was destroyed on December 14th, 2023. And in that strike alone, over 27 of my immediate and extended family members were killed. The total number is 34 of my family members. And I think that just underscores that, sadly, for Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, certainly across the world, this has been one of the deadliest chapters in contemporary history. And unfortunately, there's no end in sight for the suffering. It's not just in terms of the loss of life, but it's also the maiming, the suffering, the disability, the fact that the destruction is going to take years to reverse the impact of that. Those who have left have no clear pathway to return, and it's very painful.
What are the conditions like right now in terms of access to humanitarian aid, medical supplies, food? We hear about starvation and other problems as a real possibility for the survivors there. Gaza has been under near constant bombardment now for months and months and months and months. What do you hear about the conditions on the ground? Are there structures even still standing at this point?
Well, it's a complex picture in terms of the availability of aid. Obviously, there are severe shortages. The Israeli military has blocked the entry of humanitarian supplies and aid since March 2nd. So it's been over 2 months. Part of that is supposedly to prevent Hamas from accessing the aid and reselling it and making money off of it. And that is partially true. However, there are trusted and worthwhile partners who are able to distribute the aid, who are able to get some of that to the Palestinian civilians in need. And I think this has been a zero-sum game for some of the war planners in Israel, where it's an all or nothing approach. It's been very clear that there's an attempt to use access to medical supplies and food and basic necessities as a way to pressure Hamas by having the population pressured as well. There are some pockets of the Gaza Strip that have remnants of food and supplies. Unfortunately, we've also seen the proliferation of theft and looting and criminal elements stealing some of that aid and supplies. And I will also add, and I've been very transparent about this, that Hamas itself has been incredibly awful to the people of Gaza by worsening some of the suffering. They've not been willing to really compromise on some of the issues that could maybe bring about some relief for the suffering. So the population, the innocent civilian Palestinian population, are stuck between a merciless, horrendous war effort by the Israeli military and government and a ruthless terror organization with no end in sight for their suffering.
There is, of course, I guess, a third player on that stage, which is the government of the United States, which, and I'm not making a partisan point here, because obviously, you know, President Biden was in power, received a lot of criticism from people who are sympathetic to Palestinian suffering for not intervening to ameliorate that suffering. And now we have, obviously, President Trump in power. What do you think of the role that has been played by those administrations since October 7th?
Well, I think the United States has, in some regards, been at a very tactical level helpful in some ways and immensely damaging in other ways. I am a believer in nuance and multiple truths and multiple realities. Yes, the United States has actually supported the Israeli war effort. Yes, the United States has enabled the Israeli war effort, but it's also important to recognize the difference between the two different administrations. The Biden administration, particularly toward the end, did withhold those D9 bulldozers and some of those 2,000-pound bombs, as well as other supplies, as a way to signal its dissatisfaction with Israeli war planners. And I think in an effort to, you know, I think unfortunately people who have every right to be upset with what's happening forget that point and try to make it seem as if there's merely a continuity of the US role in how it supports the current war effort. On the other hand, we've also seen Mr. Trump, President Trump, on the one hand, release a lot of those withheld supplies to the Israeli government. On the other hand, his envoy, Mr. Witkoff, has pressured the Israeli government into accepting the ceasefire that lasted for 50 days, or 52 days rather, earlier in the year. And supposedly, what's happening right now is rumored to be some kind of a division or some kind of a split, if you will, between the Trump administration and Benjamin Netanyahu, whereby Witkoff is signaling dissatisfaction with how Netanyahu is prolonging the war. He doesn't want to compromise. He wants to keep this going to satisfy right-wing elements in the Israeli coalition at the expense of the remaining hostages and at the expense of greater deals that could be struck with the Saudis, with the region, if you will. So lots of questions remain to be answered about whether or not the Trump administration will really split from the Israeli policy in Gaza. So far, what we've seen with the release of Edan Alexander, and I'm glad that he's released. I want all Israeli hostages to be released, just as I want this war to end immediately to stop the suffering. We've not seen any indication that this is really going to lead to any relief for the Palestinian people on the ground in Gaza. And so the US role across the two administrations is quite complex, and it defies the black and white depictions that I think are so ubiquitous across much of the political analysis space.
One more question, then we'll let you go, since you're focused on how to get humanitarian aid to the Palestinians. You know, one thing that came up last year, you remember the pier the U.S. built that immediately detached and was unusable, and has been portrayed as a real boondoggle for the Biden administration, and was recently back in the news cycle for how actually dangerous it was. You know, what is the right way to navigate some of these aid-related questions with, as you said, the not wanting it looted or not wanting it to fall into the hands of Hamas, wanting to distribute it in ways that are safe to the humanitarian aid workers? What are your thoughts on the correct strategy?
Well, let me honestly state the following, that I was significant and major advocate for the airdrops and even for the pier that the United States did last year. And I will say the following about why I did that. It was beyond simply advocating for a means of delivering aid. The airdrops, for example, and I was attacked, unfortunately, by a lot of international humanitarian organizations, and the airdrops themselves were attacked. What I was trying to prove as a concept, if you will, and I've long been an avid believer that aviation and opening and a seaport in Gaza are going to be part of the Strip's transformation before October 7th and certainly after October 7th. We went from having the Israeli Air Force having the sole control over the airspace over Gaza, which it still does, to proving that with the right security coordination, you had the air forces of almost 10 nations carrying out massive airdrops with all of their aircraft over Gaza's airspace. This showed that Gaza's airspace is open for business and can be open for business to serve the Palestinian people if security is addressed. Similarly, you had a situation where Gaza's territorial waters through the maritime corridor with Cyprus was open for operation, assuming security was addressed and coordinated with Israel. I want to open Gaza's airspace and territorial waters. So right now, I think we have a codependency on Israel to enter, to allow all the supplies to go in and out. And I actually think in the long run, that's not sustainable, not just because of the political pressure that Israel can exert, but from a volume point of view. I mean, think about the reconstruction of Gaza and the vast amount of construction materials they're going to need. This is not going to be sustainable. And getting it through Egypt is also not going to be adequate. So you're going to have to activate maritime corridors. You're going to have to activate the airspace over Gaza. But for the time being, I think it's critical to get the Israeli government to agree to some middle of the road approach to let some aid in, because 2 months of not allowing anything in has really spread severe malnutrition in large pockets of the Gaza Strip. So there are interim solutions, but then there are medium and long-term solutions in which Gaza truly enjoys some level of independence while coordinating to address security issues with the Israeli government.
Ahmed, thanks so much for joining us on Rising.
Thank you.
Next up on Rising, will David Hogg be ousted from a top spot at the DNC? We'll find out. Stay with us. Is the Democratic National Committee trying to oust David Hogg? A DNC subcommittee on Monday recommended a redo of the vote that put Hogg in his top spot as National Vice Chair. The Credentials Committee passed a resolution declaring Hogg's election in February incomplete due to violations of the party's charter. The same rules would apply to the election of Pennsylvania state legislator Malcolm Kenyatta, who secured the vice chair position alongside Hogg earlier this year.
The motion comes in response to a challenge brought by Kalen Free, a committee person from Oklahoma, who unsuccessfully ran against Hogg and Kenyatta in the February race. Free alleges that the DNC used procedures that give male candidates an advantage over female candidates. The move will not be official unless the entire DNC votes in approval. Semaphore reporter David Weigel posted a statement from Hogg, which reads in part, "It is, quote, impossible to ignore the broader context of my work to reform the party, which loomed large over this vote. The DNC has pledged to remove me, and this vote provided an avenue to fast-track that effort." Kenyatta also responded, "First, yes, I disagree with the ruling, but ultimately the committee voted, and I respect their votes, even when I really disagree. Second, the press has been breathless in the coverage covering the main character they've chosen, David Hogg. They are rushing to do it again. I call BS." It's giving stop the steal to me. No, the Democratic Party is... No, I'm actually defending David Hogg here. No, he is being... and you know I'm no huge fan. He is being ousted. The Democratic Party, the party with the word democracy in its title, is using anti-democratic BS to get this feisty whippersnapper who's a troublemaker out of their way. Am I wrong?
I don't know if you're wrong, because I tried to research this as deeply as I could, and I was working my way through the complaint about this procedural vote, and I honestly couldn't make head or tail of it. I'm just not sure. I guess it's a vote, or there's some bylaw in the DNC that is supposed, I think, to allot a certain number of offices to women and
once they
non-white
finish doing
people.
the land acknowledgements, then they do that part. Yeah.
Robby, a bit of a sneer there. I'm trying to be serious about the DNC's bylaws. But look, I mean, Hogg, I think, I take Malcolm Kenyatta's point. You know, a lot of this is focused on Hogg when it does affect both of them. But it is certainly true that he has made enemies at the DNC's level with this 20 million plan to support potential primary opponents to incumbents, and it's completely within the bounds of possibility to me that he's been treated unfairly. I am no huge defender of the DNC. I mean, stretching back at least to 2016, you and I have spoken before about the fact that they very clearly put a thumb on the scales to thwart Bernie Sanders and to boost Hillary Clinton. One could make certainly arguments about Biden's re-election. So I'm sympathetic to Hogg and Kenyatta's position.
Yeah, I'm becoming more and more sympathetic to David Hogg by the day. He said some wise words, I thought, on Bill Maher's show over the weekend that you and I discussed yesterday, that actually got like a standing ovation from Bill Maher, who's you know, no fan of crazy young lefties, but David Hogg portrayed his agenda in a positive way for the Bill Maher type voter. That's a good sign. You know, I've always been skeptical of him because I never saw evidence necessarily that he really had some grand political strategy or some track record of giving good advice to help win elections. You know, he became a national celebrity because of his proximity to a horrific tragedy, and that's fine. That happens sometimes. But you know, where's the savvy political analysis? You know, his fight with James Carville, who maybe you could argue is a little bit old-fashioned or out of date, but did, you know, rack up electoral wins back in the 90s. But they actually settled their beef, and now it just seems more like the establishment moving against some up-and-coming person, the way they denied AOC the oversight committee to give it to someone who was dying of cancer. It's really remarkable how the leadership of this party keeps just going back to the same circle the wagons around older, more established people. Well, if that's what's going on here.
I mean, I think to pick up on one of the points you raised there, the fact, not only with Carville, but in general, it seemed, I thought, that Hogg and the DNC were trying to come to some sort of compromise until this happened, which does seem to be a kind of Empire Strikes Back kind of thing toward him.
Ooh, now, Star Wars reference.
I know, very rare for me. Don't, I'm not going to stretch it to Game of Thrones or whatever other show, or Dungeons and Dragons, which is your other big passion. And I do, though, share your skepticism to a degree of what the overarching strategy from Hogg is. I think I basically like him more than you do, and I'm certainly respectful of the arguments he makes. But when he was talking about the challenges, he seemed to suggest that it was partly driven purely by age, but then he was like, well, these particular old people I kind of like. So, you know, Pelosi I like and things like that. So it wasn't completely crystal clear what his actual stance is or was. But if this is some attempt to sideline him unfairly, then obviously I'm against that.
Well, we shall see. That does it for us today on Rising. Thanks so much for watching, and be sure to like, to share, and to subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we're now available anywhere you listen to podcasts. I'll be on with Linda Tran tomorrow, and Niall will be back for the rest of the week. We'll see you later.